Good morning. I'm Rick Nelson. I'm chair of the HOC Budget, Finance, and Administration Committee. This is our May 12th meeting. Welcome to the meeting. We will begin. The first item is the approval of minutes of our last meeting, which was April 14th. April 14th, I believe. Yes.
April 14th.
April 14th. Do I have a motion for approval of those minutes?
I move that we approve. I second.
There's been a motion and a second. Pardon me, please. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Then the minutes are approved. The first item for presentation is the fiscal year 2024 budget presentation on the Opportunity Housing Fund budget. Our Executive Director, Chelsea Andrews.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, commissioners, members of the public, HLC team. We are presenting today two budgets just to put in context in terms of how we are approaching the budget this year and how we have in the past. There are a series of meetings that we've had because of how comprehensive and extensive our budget is. So today we're focused on these two areas. We also have our standing BFNA meeting next Friday. So just putting that in context, because I think with all of these meetings going through the budget, it can get a little confusing. I want to turn it over to our finance team to provide additional context and details on both of these items. So I'll turn it over to Terry Fowler, our budget officer, who will set context and lead the way. Thank you.
Terry, before you begin, I'm sorry, I failed to introduce the other members of the Budget, Finance, and Audit Committee. Jeffrey Merkowitz is here, and Fran Kelleher, the vice chair of the commission, is virtual.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Terry Fowler, budget officer at HOC. And thank you, Executive Director Andrews, and good morning to the commissioners and staff and the viewing public. On April 14th, Vivian and Ikuro and myself presented the review of the FY24 recommended budget for the general fund and the public fund. In today's meeting, Vivian and I will review the recommended budget for Opportunity Housing, which includes our fiscal year properties, mortgage finance, and the real estate development division budgets, and inform the committee of any changes that will be made before we present the budget for adoption. And I will turn it over to Vivian to present Opportunity Housing.
Thank you, Terry. Good morning, commissioners, Executive Director Andrews, staff, and the viewing public. For the record, my name is Vivian Ikoro, Financial Analyst with the Budget Office. Today, I will be presenting the FY24 recommended budget for the Opportunity Housing Fund. The Opportunity Housing Fund includes HOC's fiscal year properties and the Opportunity Housing Reserve Fund, OHRF. The OHRF will be discussed during the presentation of the Mortgage Finance and Real Estate Development Division budgets. If we can begin by moving to page 11 of the packet. Thank you. This chart represents the FY24 agency recommended operating budget as presented at the April 5th, 2023 Commission's meeting. At that time, we presented a budget of $331.8 million that was balanced with a draw of $1.56 million from the General Fund Operating Reserve account. Thus far, we have not made changes to the agency recommended budget. If we can now move to page 12 of the packet. Thank you. This chart represents a 5-year overview of the income in the Opportunity Housing Fund, which is broken out into operating and non-operating income. You will note that non-operating income are in light blue. The income for the FY24 recommended budget was $110.56 million, the majority of which is based on rental income, net of concessions and vacancies, coupled with income from retail space, laundry and parking income, and various fees. In addition, federal funding from the McKinney Grant reimburses certain costs for units at Montgomery Arms. Finally, transfers between funds include county funding for various costs as well as funding for shortfalls at a few properties that are being covered by transfers from existing property cash or the general fund operating reserve account. Overall, income increased by 3.73 million or 3.5%, primarily due to an increase in tenant income resulting from higher county executive voluntary rent guideline of 5.8% and operating cost adjustment factor OCAF of 6.6% used for rent increases. Moving on to page 13. Thank you.
Before we leave that page, can I ask one question? And tell me if you're going to cover this later and we could just move on. But the non-dwelling rental income is projected to go down. And I know that a lot of commercial space is sitting vacant everywhere now. Is that the reason for that? Is there something else behind that other than just the general shift in the economy of commercial space?
No, the decrease is due to the income that we receive for the Brookville lot that we have, and also the areas that we're receiving income in Wheaton. They are not included in the operating budget, but in the actuals, they are included because that income is received and restricted to the fund.
Okay.
So it's for properties that are slated for future development that
we're receiving
income from.
And did that begin in?
Can I finish for a minute? Is that, I'm trying to understand why the drop from the 1 million and the previous in 22 actual of 1.7?
If we go from just FY23 amended to the recommended, yes, we do have changes in our current retail that we have at both the Metropolitan and Metro Point. And we do have some concessions with changes in landlords that occur at those properties when we get a new tenant for their lease up. I was referring to the large reduction from the actuals.
From FY22.
Yes.
Okay, it's still not clear why that went down if it's just rent income from space that's not developed yet, but we can work on that.
Just to provide further clarity, it's not because it's not developed. It's not included in our operating budget for the agency because we are not using the income to support the agency. And there has been questions over the years of what we were going to do. So we did not include that income in both the FY23 and FY24 budgets. However, we do receive, we have never budgeted for that income because of what is impending on the properties. It has not been used as a source to support agency operations thus far.
But I think the question is being raised, and in FY22, it was 1.7 million. It is now down to 945,000. Why is it $800,000?
We will continue to receive that income, but we are not including it as part of the agency budget. But when we pull the actuals for the total opportunity housing fund, it's pulled in the actuals. So that's why you see it in the actual years, but not in the budget. It has been conscious decisions to not include it in the budget because when we have been developing the budgets, we did not know what would be going on at that property for the following year.
So does that mean we can expect that line item for the actuals for 23 to be higher than what it is or what is budgeted?
And it is a decision that we can make in terms of whether we want to use those funds until future development has to support agency operations, but thus far it has not been used to support agency operations. And
okay, whether it is or not, it seems we should be recognizing what we expect it to be somewhere.
And I think what's being said is that it is reflected in a restricted budget for those particular properties, but not included in our operational budget because we do not know and do not want to anticipate having that income continue for the next year when we don't know the disposition. So we're putting those funds in a restricted account that is likely to be reflected in another presentation or somewhere else in our budget, but is not included in our operational budget because we are not anticipating and do not want to rely on that income stream when there are discussions about potential disposition of those properties.
Brookville is an example that Tara mentioned in Littonsville.
I think we understand that, but I guess the question then following up on that is, where is this restricted income shown?
It's in the Opportunity Housing financials, but not in the agency operating budget.
So does it get shifted then?
So it is nowhere reflected in the proposed budget for 2024.
Correct.
That's the question that Fran's raising, and I think you were saying that it is somewhere.
No, I was saying it's not in the operational budget, but there is a restricted account for those income streams, the rent received. But what we're presenting to you is what we need to operate, and those funds aren't included in the operational budget.
But we do normally budget income, even though it's going into restricted accounts, and show that it's going to be restricted.
As a reserve.
I think the point being raised is that it appears that we've got, even though it's not an overly significant amount, we have some money that we're expected to come in, but it doesn't appear to be budgeted and or restricted.
That is correct. However, you are true that when we show income and restrictions, we can make a change to the budget before the proposed budget if the commission so advises that we could put in the projection for 24 of what the revenue will be for Brookville. We will have to determine how far into 24 that will actually be revenue. That has been the uncertainty for that property. For the Wheaton Gateway area, the income we're getting there, we will also confirm how long that will go on. And if you so advise, we can add it and make a change to the budget.
Are there any other income items that we don't budget?
Those are the two properties that are showing that large income. Yes.
I think it'd be good to show the reserve somewhere. Our budget should reflect everything we're expecting to come in terms of revenue, even if we automatically put it into a reserve.
Sure. We can work with real estate and mortgage finance to determine the length of that income and the amount of the projection for 24 and put that in as a revision before the budget comes to you in June for adoption. The executive director confirms.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi there, Tim Getzinger, acting CFO. I did just want to note, yeah, there are those two properties that were mentioned, the Veers Mill property and the Brookville Road. I do want to note, and yes, there's absolutely, it's important to make sure that these budgets are accurately reflected. I do want to note, just for the record, this is less than 1% of the total budget. We definitely want to make sure that it is accurate. It's not a sizable portion. And if you do look from, 20 to 21, there is fluctuation in there. So it is difficult to get the actual amount, but we can tweak that and try to sharpen it a little bit. Thank you for that comment.
Thank you for the additional context.
Thank you. And if there are no more questions, we will move on to page 13. Thank you. This chart reflects the distribution of the source of funds received to support the Opportunity Housing Fund. As you can see, tenant rents make up 106.36 million or 96.2% of the fund's revenue. The remaining 3.8% comes from transfers between funds, non-dwelling income from retail space, laundry and packing income, various fees, and the federal grant for the McKinney units. If we now move on to page 14, thank you. We can see that this slide provides an overview of a 5-year detail of the expenses in the Opportunity Housing Fund which is broken out into operating and non-operating expenses. You will note that non-operating expenses are in light blue. The FY24 recommended budget included expenses totaling $107.3 million. Unlike the general fund and public fund, in which personnel costs make up the majority of the operating expenses, the Opportunity Housing Fund has expenses spread across several categories that support the operations of the properties. On the operating side, expenses included debt services, operating and replacement reserve contributions, restricted cash flow, and the development corporation fees. Overall, expenses increased by $3 million or 2.9% from FY23, primarily due to increases in most operating expense categories, coupled with higher development corporation expenses that represent unrestricted cash from the properties that was partially offset by reductions in debt service payments and reserve contributions based on upcoming renovations, coupled with reductions in restricted cash flow.
Before you move on to the next slide, on the bad debt expense, is that reflective of the fact that our residents are not receiving rental assistance?
You said the debt service expense?
Bad debt.
Yes, we spoke about this at the last meeting. It's not due to their lack of rental assistance. Primarily, it's due to their lack of rental payments. We are in the process and have been applying the rental assistance that has been received. You will actually see a reduction in the total bad debt expense in the third quarter budget to actuals. So we are starting to see a turn in that expense. Unfortunately, we do not have enough information at this time to know exactly how that will impact 24. I do anticipate that expense will come down. When these budgets were produced, our bad debt was steadily increasing. We are starting to see that turn, and I do anticipate that we will have a budget amendment in December once this plays out further that will reflect the impact of the rental assistance that's been received and lease enforcement on our properties.
Okay. Next question I have is protective service expenses. Can you help me out in terms of what's happening there?
The primary increase there is for our cider mill property for the increased security at that site. That is also the reason our restricted cash has gone down this year due to the rising expenses at cider mill for security. But that reflects all of our security systems, our monitoring, as well as our life safety security measures that we have at our properties. But the reason for the large increase this year is primarily at cider mill.
Yeah, I was curious about that expense as well. And I mean, both what was happening this year, and I was assuming it was cider mill, but just noticing that historically, I mean, you know, the previous high was in 2020, and then it had kind of bounced around a little bit and then took a big dip in this current year.
There are times also where we'll have a fire watch at a particular property. For instance, we've had a fire watch this past year due to a faulty fire panel at one of our properties. When that happens, we have increased security at the property. So we have had that type of a fluctuation over the years. A few years back, we had that at Strathmore Court. We've had it at some other properties. So that account includes your typical, you know, security measures that you have, your security systems, et cetera. But anytime we have an event at a property where it requires a fire marshal or someone doing a fire watch or added security for various items and increased security at a property, that item will fluctuate due to those circumstances. When that occurs, you will typically see an explanation of that in our quarterly budget to actuals.
I'd also like to add that we are providing in this budget for a security guard at each of our offices that was not budgeted previously. And so to ensure the safety of our staff, many of our offices currently do not have security this is the only office that has security. We are including in this budget providing security guards at each of our sites.
Have we had incidents?
We've had, well, definitely with the uprise of challenges across the US, there's been a heightened level of concern and anxiety, but we have had instances of threats where we've wanted to make sure that every site had the proper security present. Thankfully, we have not had any incident that has caused any challenge for our staff, but we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable and safe. And this is included in the budget to ensure that.
I did also have questions on, sort of the declines in the debt service payments, which is, it was nice to see. They're not huge, but I was just curious, do we have less debt going on, and especially the big drop in mortgage insurance?
Sorry.
Yeah.
When we have a property that goes into renovations, during renovations, the property operation does not bear the debt service. The Metropolitan is slated for renovations in the upcoming year. And so the debt service we're paying now will be borne by the development budget. So for both Metropolitan DevCorp and Metropolitan Affordable, you'll see that the debt service payments are removed from the budget, as well as the replacement reserve contributions during that time.
Okay.
And we had one small property pay off its county loan, but that was a small amount of about $53,000. But typically when you see a change in debt, it's due to renovations or it's due to properties transitioning out of opportunity housing into tax credit, which we had a couple of years ago and you saw reductions. But in that instance, you would also see corresponding reductions to all the expenses and income for the removal of the property. This year, it is primarily due to Metropolitan.
And did that property have a high level of mortgage insurance? Because it seems like the drop in mortgage insurance is a little bit disproportional to.
It did. For the record, I'm Kareen Brown, Deputy Executive Director, and the Metropolitan did, I believe, for a 90% of the risk on a $30-some million loan. And upon refinance, we hope to restructure that.
Is there anywhere in the budget that we can determine the FTEs that we are funding during the year?
I didn't hear the first part.
Is there anywhere in the budget that we can determine the number of FTEs, employees, that we are funding? We have dollar amounts, but to my knowledge, we don't have an explanation of how many employees, either total or by
Right.
office.
We do have it in the budget. It's also in the budget book. The recommended budget book in the personnel section does show the number of employees by division. I want to note that in this particular presentation, unlike the others, the personnel costs that you're seeing are not just employees of HOC, but also the employees of all of our contract management companies that provide management services for our properties.
What?
You had a question, Fran? Oops.
It might be nice to be able to split those two out. But we could get that at.
I guess let me provide some clarity. A part of our budgets for the different properties include us having the budget for what it costs to operate, and that includes their staff in that budget. So it's operational expense, maintenance expense, any other expense for that property. So that rolls up here. In terms of our operating expense and our staff, that personnel budget is outlined in our overall budget book, and with a little time, I'll tell you where we could locate it.
But I think what Fran was just raising is that, for clarity's sake, why do we roll up the contract personnel expense with our, why aren't they separated out so that we can separately identify?
They are separated in our financials and we can provide that breakout, but when we roll this up to a consolidated income statement for opportunity housing, we do not distinguish between external staff and internal staff because it is the staffing cost of the property regardless of whether it is ours or theirs. I do understand the importance of understanding how much is from the contract manager, and we can provide that detail. But at these high level roll-ups, we're showing the total staffing costs for the property.
Okay.
It'll be great to get that breakout.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, we will now move to page 15. Thank you. The slide on page 15 reflects the distribution of the use of funds in the Opportunity Housing Fund. The chart shows you a breakout of operating and non-operating expenses. You can see from the pie on the left that expenses for the properties are nearly equally divided between operating expenses of 53.23% and non-operating of 46.77%. The largest non-operating category is debt service of 35.86 million or 33.42%, which equates to almost 3/4 of total non-operating expenses, followed by contributions to reserves, which account for 5.14 million or 4.79%. Finally, the distribution of cash flow to the Development Corporation fees of 6.04 million or 5.63%, and the restricted cash of 3.14 million or 2.92%. We now move on to page 16. Thank you. This chart reflects a 5-year history of total property cash flow, which is broken into 3 categories: the Development Corporation fees, unrestricted cash flow, and restricted cash flow. As you can see from this chart, total projected cash flow has increased by approximately 1.03 million for FY24 when compared to the FY23 amended budget. This is largely due to increase in Development Corporation fees from the Metropolitan and VPC2, Alexandria House projecting positive cash flow instead of a loss, and increased cash flow from Strathmore Court that were partially offset by the removal of cash flow from Elizabeth House and a decrease in restricted cash flow at Cider Mill. This brings an end to the Opportunity Housing FY24 recommended budget presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have at this time. Thank you.
You have any other questions? You have any other questions, Fran?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Again, for the record, I'm Terry Fowler, Budget Officer at HOC, and I will be presenting the FY24 recommended budgets for the mortgage finance and real estate divisions. If we could go to page 22 of the packet. Again, this represents the FY24 agency recommended budget as presented at the April 5th, 2023 commission meeting. And we have not introduced changes at this time, although we will add the change for incorporating the retail income from the 2 sites into the proposed budget. That will also change at the end of my presentation. You will see that we do have changes for the budget. On this page, as Vivian mentioned, our recommended budget was $331.8 million with a projected draw of $1.56 million from the general fund operating reserve. If you look at the blue boxes on the chart, unlike the previous presentations, which focused on individual funds, today's meeting will involve discussions related to all 5 funds: the general fund, the multifamily and single family bond funds, the OHRF that is a part of Opportunity Housing Fund, and the county grant section of our public fund. Excuse me, if we can move on to page 23 of our packet. This chart on page 23 shows you a 5-year detail of the mortgage finance division. You will again notice that non-operating income and expenses are noted in light blue. The division generates loan management and commitment fees on the transactions that are financed by HOC and monitored for loan and regulatory compliance. Commitment fees are split with 40% being unrestricted to support agency operations and 60% restricted to the OHRF for future capital investment in real estate. This income supplements the unrestricted cash from our properties to balance the agency budget. You will notice in the dark blue, the fees for FY 2024 have increased $3.04 million from the recommended budget, of which approximately $1.22 million is unrestricted and $1.82 million is restricted. The majority of this increase are projects that, due to timing changes, have shifted from the FY 23 budget to 24, and that again will be reflected in your budget to actuals for next Friday's meeting. Moving on to
Still pretty big jump, even shifting that, because I mean FY 23 was almost doubled from 22.
To be clear, the FY 23 budget that is here is the official amended budget, so that does not show you the reduction of that shift. So for the purposes of looking at this chart, that income is still included there because we have not done a budget amendment for the shift. Typically, we do not do budget amendments for changing in the timing of fees because they consistently happen through the year, dependent on the changes in the development budgets. Approval for those changes goes through the Development and Finance Committee, and then ultimately Commission for approval of the changes to the development budgets. If we move on to page 24 of your packet, this graph shows in pie form the breakout of the 2024 projected revenue in the revised budget. As you see, commitment fees makes up $7.4 million, or approximately 48.67%. Of this revenue, $4.461 million, or 29.2%, is restricted to the OHRF, and $2.974 million, or 19.47%, goes to the general fund to support agency operation. Bond draws account for $4.156 million, or 27.21%, and that covers the administrative costs for both the single and multifamily bond programs. The FHA risk sharing is $1.081 million, or 7.08%. We also have a county closing cost grant for the administrative cost of that program of approximately $209,000. And finally, loan management fees represents $2.395 million, or 15.67%. Moving on to page 25 of your packet, this pie graph breaks out the projected expenses of $5.679 million. As you see, personnel makes up $2.874 million, or 50.6%. Other operating expenses total $135,000, and management fees that are paid to the agency for overhead is $1.527 million, or 26.88%. Mortgage insurance and trust.
Wait, can I clarify? Money that's going from the real estate development to pay overhead for the agency is considered a management fee?
Okay, so just for clarity, we're not talking about real estate development yet. This is the mortgage finance division.
Okay.
And because of the structure of our bonds and grants, when we allocate overhead to those divisions, the category that in our income statement that we use is called management expense, as opposed to allocated overhead. They both represent the same thing. We have a cost allocation model that determines the factors used to calculate the appropriate overhead to be charged to the properties. For our grants and for mortgage finance, it's based on a percentage of personnel costs. For our properties, it is broken down into a per unit per monthly dollar rate. And that income goes towards the agency to cover overhead. And we have restrictions on many of our programs as to how much we can charge, and therefore it's crucial for the income from our unrestricted properties and the fees generated by these two divisions, mortgage finance and real estate, to assist in balancing the budget to support our mission.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then finally, FHA risk sharing, which showed as income here, is also then restricted to that reserve for the properties that have the FHA risk sharing insurance. We can move to page 26. We'll move on to real estate development. Again, broken out between the income in general has the operating income, which are the fees that are received, and then non-operating income, which are draws from the OHRF to support the personnel costs and pre-development funds for projects that have not yet moved to the level of having an individual development budget. Similar to our commitment fees, development fees are split, with 40% being unrestricted to support agency operations and 60% going to the OHRF for future capital investments. Again, we have an increase in those projected fees for fiscal 24 of just over $3 million, of which 1.22 million is unrestricted. I'm sorry, 1.36 million is unrestricted and 2.04 is restricted to the OHRF. That takes us to the last chart in the packet. Yes.
Is this same thing, shifting money from this year to next year?
There are some shifts, and there are also some changes in the size of the development fee that we're going to get. So this does not have as much of a shift from 23 that we saw in commitment fees, which was a full shift over from 23. With development fees, because the timing is dependent, especially on the tax credit deals, of achieving certain milestones, mortgage finance, real estate, and property management look at those projected achievements. Sometimes a fee may actually move sooner than was originally anticipated. So there's more fluctuation in development fees than you see in commitment fees, which are paid once, and development fees many times are paid over the life of the deal.
Okay. And so we can expect to see a drop in the current year's actuals, but not to the same extent.
Not to the same extent, but yes, there is a drop in the current year's actuals.
Okay. On the expense side, could you just talk a little bit about the administrative operating expenses and what happened there?
The majority of that is a pre-development fund that the commission authorized. It's been several years that we set a pre-development fund, because many times there is work related to upcoming projects for zoning and consulting fees that we don't have a designated source for. So there was a commitment that we could draw up to $300,000 from the OHRF for that. As you can see in the prior years, we have not typically drawn the full amount. And to the extent possible, when we incur an expense, if that is determined to be reimbursable from a particular project or deal, then those funds will be transferred to that and not drawn from the OHRF.
Okay.
Any more questions before I move to the summary?
No.
Okay. On page 27 of your packet, this shows the revised budget incorporating the changes that we have discussed thus far. And you can see in the general fund that we do have the increase of the unrestricted commitment fees of 1.2 million and unrestricted development fees of 1.36 million. In the OHRF, we have the increase of the restricted portion, 60% or 1.8 million in commitment fees and 60% or 2.0 million in development fees. The increase in those fees for the OHRF will be restricted to the OHRF. It is the recommendation that since the recommended budget was balanced with a projected draw from the general fund of approximately 1.56 million, we are recommending that we remove that draw and that the remaining surplus of 1.02 million be restricted for the general fund operating reserve to restore the funds that are anticipated to be drawn to balance the FY23 budget as a result of the removal of the commitment fees that had moved to 2024 and the development fees. We are still in the fourth quarter. We've just looked at the third quarter. We will flush that out in September to determine where we are and how much we may have to draw from the general fund operating reserve. But we are recommending that this money be restricted to help reimburse any funds that may have to be drawn. We do anticipate that there will be some small changes. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop because I think you have a question.
What did we budget to draw from the operating reserve in 23?
We have a budget right now of just under $1 million projected to be drawn. Historically, due to savings and expenses, salary lapse, and other changes, sometimes fees go up.
Right.
We have not had to draw, but we do anticipate that because of the combination of the continued impacts on our rents and rising costs on our property, specifically for maintenance expenses, that we will have to draw from the reserve at year end. And so we are taking a conservative approach to say that since this surplus resulted from those fees shifting, that we should replenish the reserve with that excess. And as I mentioned, we will do an update to the complement to update for staff turnover that has occurred since the recommended budget. We will incorporate the change discussed earlier in the Opportunity Housing Fund and bring a reconciliation to the commission on June 14th, showing the changes that have occurred from the recommended to the adopted budget.
You also said that it'll be September when we determine how much we actually have to draw from the reserve.
That is when we'll do the final reconciliation and reporting, because the fourth quarter meeting is not until September. We should have a better idea of where we'll be when we see how the additional rental assistance application in this fourth quarter affects our bad debt.
Okay.
Are there any other questions related to these or the previous presentation that we did on the 14th?
You have any questions, Fran?
No, I don't. Thank you.
No questions.
All right. Well, we thank you. And we look forward to the June 14 meeting.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners.
With no further items on the agenda, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.